Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the PRCA Southeast Asia webinar on the fake news infodemic and COVID-19. We have more than 70 participants registered, and thank you all for joining for what I'm sure is going to be a very interesting and informative session on how we can protect our brands better from the scourge of fake news and misinformation. Let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Anuradha, and I'll be the moderator of this event. I'm the founder of CyberCognizanz, a Singapore-based company that does education, training, research, and communications on cyber safety and cybersecurity. Now, let me introduce you to our wonderful speakers. We have with us Antoine Calendrier, MPRCA. As part of Edelman APAC leadership team, Antoine runs the firm's reputation practice for North Asia and crisis practice for APAC, responsible for accelerating the firm's trust advisory services across the region. Antoine's current client consulting work includes leading corporate communications for a global automotive OEM, covering CEO communications, governance, issues and crisis, storytelling, corporate narrative, thought leadership, and media relations. Welcome, Antoine. We have with us also Emma Richards, who has over 20 years comms experience across both agency and in-house. Having spent the last decade in Asia, working in regional roles out of Hong Kong and now Singapore, Emma is currently Head of Communications Asia for HP. Her specialism is building multi-market brand communications campaigns, grounded in data and insights that drive both corporate reputation and audience-centric impact. We also have Jeremy Seow, MPRCA, who is the Managing Director, Growth and Innovation at Allison+Partners. Jeremy entered the world of marketing communications in 2004 and has since worked with brands on their digital marketing and communications programs. Jeremy's primary focus at Allison+Partners is working with the agency's leadership across the network to drive growth opportunities, new products, and strategic services to a host of clients. Welcome, Emma and Jeremy. Last but not least, we have Larry Lowe. As a career communicator, Larry took the long way around, starting first as a tech journalist and editor, followed by an agency stint with Edelman in Hong Kong, before venturing in-house with global brands such as HTC and the GSMA. Now Larry leads communications for Twitter across the Asia-Pacific region, a role which he stepped into shortly before the pandemic hit. So it's been a roller coaster so far in 2020. I'm sure that's an understatement, Larry.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for having me, Anu.
You're welcome. As you can see, we are in very good hands when it comes to discussing the impact of fake news from a PR and communications perspective. Now, we'll be doing this in an interactive and conversational format and covering the following broad topics: the impacts of fake news on brands, followed by how companies are responding to fake news in the new normal, and thirdly, the challenges faced in battling fake news. Now, for the audience, you may pose your questions in the chat box at any point of time, and I'll try and take as many as those as possible after the panel discussion. I'll kickstart the proceedings with a quick introduction to the topic and provide a little bit of context about fake news and COVID-19. So fake news has become such a massive global problem that efforts to curb it are often referred to in terms of battles and war, akin to the war on terror. That's quite a similarity that you see these days. Now, while the phenomenon of inaccurate or misleading information isn't new, it's been part of human communication forever. Social media has accelerated this problem and made fake news part and parcel of our hyper-connected world. And because of US President Donald Trump, the term fake news is now part of our everyday vocabulary. And as you can see, with reference to Donald Trump, clearly fake news means different things to different people. So I thought I'd begin by giving you a broad set of definitions of what fake news means. And these are definitions that we may not all agree upon. And I'll ask the panelists after this what they think of is fake news to them and their organizations. But to begin with, fake news at its very core is news that is fabricated or made up, or news that is only partially accurate. But what makes this really sinister is that it looks and feels like real news. And this is the big problem because it is easy to deceive people more and more as technology becomes more and more sophisticated. And as I mentioned before, social media exacerbates this problem. We also have another term swirling about, which is misinformation. Now, this is usually referred to as information that is inaccurate or incorrect, but which can result from an honest mistake or negligence, ignorance, or even an unconscious bias. So sometimes if you have a bias about a certain topic, you tend to forward this information because you feel it's already true, but you're not really checking before you're sending it. And then you have disinformation, which is misinformation that is supplied with the deliberate aim to mislead. Now you can see that the motives for both these terms are different. Their motives are very different, but what happens in reality, in practice, is that these two tend to overlap and feed off each other. So it becomes quite difficult to separate the two on the ground or in cyberspace. And both contribute overall to the phenomenon of fake news. Now, if we look at COVID-19 and the fake news infodemic, in recent years, every major issue, whether it's elections, say the Brexit referendum, terrorist attacks, national elections, the US election especially, has been accompanied by fake news and misinformation. But in the case of COVID-19, there has been an unprecedented surge of fake news, misinformation, whatever term you call it, that has been swirling around the world as millions and millions of people are online day and night for every single need. And this is what makes this particular point in history a very interesting and significant one, and why fake news plays such a huge role at this point of time. And this is why we thought we would bring this topic to you, because in many cases, the surge of fake news is more dangerous than the global pandemic itself. And we can talk about this later if time permits. But for now, I'd like to pose these questions to the speakers. The first question being, how do your organizations define and understand fake news, firstly? And secondly, do you see any marked difference in the scale and types of fake news pre-COVID and now, especially in relation to your own brands? And Larry, perhaps you could begin.
Sure. No, thanks to the PRCA for having me here, and it's great having this discussion at this time. Particularly, at this environment when the world is pretty much all under lockdown. Now, right off the bat, when you look at the term fake news, Anu, as what you said, it picked up mainstream popularity, with President Trump. But at Twitter, we avoid that phrase because, as you noted, it's too loosely used. And to be honest, everyone have their own definition of it. And what we do use commonly at Twitter, are the terms misinformation or, well, misleading information or disinformation. Now, at its core, we have a strong set of policies that guide the way we regulate content, or posted on our platforms. I won't go into details about the policies. That's a whole other very long discussions. But for example, let me give you an example. In March this year, as the pandemic went into full effect, we broadened our policies to address content that went directly against guidance on COVID-19, both from authoritative sources of global and local health information, as well as putting a ban on COVID-related advertising. So we see fake news, we define fake news as misinformation in that sense, where it's intended to misguide, whether it's both from posting it to a unreliable source, and we've done we've actioned labeling actions on this with world leaders and so on, as you've all seen, as well as putting out working with local, health authorities to really bring across credible sources of news, and that's something that we see strongly as part of our mission, to guide the public conversation, and that's something that we see very strongly. As to how it's changed, during the pandemic, I think pre and post COVID, I think that term was already in use, but I think with the world under lockdown, we've seen such a strong surge in the use of social media, not just in Twitter, but across all platforms, where people are turning to their preferred channels, to stay connected, to find out about news. It becomes an issue where, it becomes all too easy to, put across all these different misinformation labels, not checking strongly enough the sources that you have. So that's something that we see as the trend. With COVID, everything now becomes put under a giant magnifying glass, and that's something that we are trying we strive, and our mission has always been to kind of promote that public conversation, and that it by itself is ongoing journey. How do we define the public conversation? What are public interests that we are trying to serve, and so on? And that's something we put in place, and we're constantly developing and enforcing our policies to follow up on that. Yeah, over to you. I would love to hear what my fellow panelists have to say about that.
Right. Thank you, Larry. I mean, it's certainly an issue that is evolving every second of every day. So sort of we are really literally doing this in real time. All of us are doing this in real time as we speak. So maybe I'll ask Emma to sort of pick up from where Larry left off as well.
Yeah, sure. And I think, both of you raised some really interesting points about just how do you define fake news. I think as a brand, we look at it through three lenses. One is misinformation, or in terms of the disinformation, as you've just called it as well, Anu, which is where it's designed to almost create a certain perception of you as a brand. The second is information that's out of date. We have a lot of information and stories that have been out there for years ago, and it's very easy for people to package this information together and come up with something that seems very current. And the third is basically information that is just actually incorrect. And I think it's really important when you think about it through that lens. And then we also have to filter it, though, in terms of where is this news being actually delivered? What's the platform that it's on? Is it on a platform that we trust? Is it on a platform that we know drives fake news? And how much is that actually gathering speed? And I think being able to assess the type of news that it is, where that news is actually taking place, and how much it's growing becomes really important as a brand as you start to think about fake news and what does it mean to me. Now, I think the piece that's really important in all of this, though, is fundamentally it's about trust. I've mentioned this a moment ago in terms of the platforms that we have news across. It's also in terms of the trust that we have as a brand. Now, ultimately, if you don't have trust as a brand, when you try to take action, whether that is to correct inaccurate information, whether that is, to issue a statement, if you don't have trust, then you can just end up fueling something that is basically a perception that's already there. And so I think it's even more so, particularly not just in the current environment. I think this has been taking shape over the past sort of, 4 or 5 years, that, how do you really build trust in your brand? And that ability to drive trust, I think today, and I think COVID shone a spotlight on this more than ever, is it's not what you say, it's what you do. And as a brand, you've got to be very clear about the commitments that you're going to make and about the action that you're going to take to deliver on those commitments. At HP, for example, we are a very purpose-driven brand. And a lot of what we did during COVID was how did we pivot to help people on the front line using 3DP to produce face masks and get that out as quickly as possible to frontline workers. So it was our ability to pivot our business and being able to demonstrate where we're actually having impact that allowed us more to be able to have what I would see as a credible and a true story. Now, to the point of how much has this really sort of changed during COVID, what was really important as a brand again during COVID for us was our employees. The safety of our employees was number one. And it was really important that the information that they received from us was accurate and it was timely and that it was aligned ultimately to the government regulations. Now, the challenges we have in Asia, as anybody who's probably dialing in from an in-house perspective also knows, is every single government had a completely different take on what they were going to do. And so the ability to keep across that and make sure that it was government-driven information or from the health authorities was so important, because ultimately as a brand we became that trusted advisor to our employees to ensure that the information that we were giving them was correct, and that trust that people had in us and our employees needed from us became even more important, and it helped us to be able to advise them on why we were making certain decisions in the way that we were and help them to understand how it was really about putting their safety first. So I just sort of think in summary of what you're saying there is that I don't think it's just about fake news. I think it's about where that fake news is. And I think it's about the perception of the brand and the way that that brand has already built some level of a halo effect or credibility with their audiences about how they can also manage fake news in an environment like COVID.
Right. Thank you, Emma. I think it's absolutely accurate in terms of, and this whole event is about the impact on trust and reputation and brand safety. And I like the fact that you sort of brought it up right at the beginning, and this is something that's on top of your minds as well for all of you as sort of you wade through this sea of bad information out there. And I thought I'd next ask Antoine the same questions in relation to fake news and COVID. And of course, we'll talk about the issues of trust and reputation a little more as we go along as well.
Right. Thank you very much, Anu. And indeed, I mean, those are very strong points that are being made by Emma and Larry and yourself. So from our perspective as an agency, we see fake news as deliberate disinformation, pretty much. So it's a little bit more directional than what I think we've discussed so far. In our view, it's really an information that is intended to mislead in order to have an impact. And oftentimes it's a damage to the benefits. So for a gain, a competitive gain, for instance, a financial gain or else. And it's spread through mostly social media. So from our perspective, a fake news versus perhaps a false or erroneous news in the fact that it is fabricated, as you noted earlier. But what is the implication for brands? So the brands oftentimes are the victim of such thing. And the one thing that they need to do first is really to understand the underlying dynamic of what's happening. And I think that's one of the key implications from one news versus a fake news is what is actually happening, right? And so that's oftentimes why clients go to us and look for kind of a diagnosis or an analysis as to what do you think is in play here. So it's much more kind of directional than perhaps other types of news. Whether it's making, for instance, false connections or putting a news in a false context, or even manipulating the content. We're perhaps going to talk about deep fakes and others. And now you can have really the cost of technology to do that is close to zero now. Almost anybody can do that. Misleading content, fabricating content, but really the implications for the brand is really what is the underlying dynamic, and you need to start there. And that's why it's so tricky, because it's not easy to actually understand what's going on. So, and as Emma was saying, we look at at fake news in the context of trust building. And what really matters really is how fake news impact trust. From our perspective, it's both a risk, so something that needs to be mitigated, but it's also more and more just a parameter. It's becoming table stake. It's like in the foreseeable future, fake news is going to be part of the playbook of any firm in a way that is very, as perhaps social media was back 10 years ago when we were wondering if we need to treat that specifically. Now it's just the water itself, right? And so that I think what is going to change. So that's going to become more and more normalized. But we're seeing two things in that context. One thing is that from the Trust Barometer research that we have this year is that most people worry that technology is making it increasingly impossible to know to decipher between what to see if what they are seeing or hearing is real, right? So they don't really know when they see something or they hear something because of technology, if it's real or not. And that's a real problem because that's filtering your way into the reality. The second thing is most people, the majority of people today believe that the media that they are using are contaminated with untrustworthy information. And the last bit that is a new phenomenon is the fact that people now worry that false information can be used as a weapon against them. So there is a real concern, and so I think that's the conversation of today is really to address that, is that it's becoming more and more of a concern. It's a parameter for people to operate. So what do we do about that with brands?
Right, absolutely, Antoine. I like the point that you made that it is now fake news is sort of part of the playbook of any firm. And I think I'll move then sort of with that in mind to Jeremy's perspective.
So first of all, I'd like to say this back here is disinformation. Obviously, I'm setting up that setting so that I can give you guys the illusion I'm in outer space and it's meant to deceive, etc., etc. But look, it's great to have Larry, Antoine, and Emma in front of me. They covered up a lot of the areas that I talked about. But look, a couple of things I just want to add to my peers on this group. Right? One is that I'm really optimistic the fact that we are in an age where we are dealing with a more savvy online audience today. Let's not doubt the ability to look at what is real, shady, and what is just plain fake. I think that level has gone up over time as well. The second thing is a more regulated media environment in the regions that we're operating in as well. That's obviously, whether is it in the industry boards or in the governments, they are paying a good attention for that. And the last bit where I'm really, really optimistic about is the ability for marketers or communicators like many of us over here on the call today, having access to the right data and the back looking at how they can then look at recovery and dealing from fake news or misinformation, right? And I think that for me that is, and I agree with Antoine, it is going to be a big parcel of the playbook that what brands are going to deal with today. Having worked with a lot of brands, they are dealing with that. But then how do we help them? It's not about when, it's not about if, it's about when they meet with a situation like that, and how do they move towards recovery, right? Really understanding the impact on that piece of news, how far it's traveled, how fast it's traveled, near or far, whether it's in your country, is it outside your country, and sometimes even getting to the point where we have the right data today to even tell brands, is like, actually, you know what? One day, 9 out of 10 pieces of misinformation, you might not even need to deal with it with a public statement, because you're just going to set up a new cycle, right? Because your stakeholders, as we've seen with that Coca-Cola incident with Dasani, where their stakeholders really came in to step up in front of them and say, like, this is fake to begin with, right? So I think that a lot of things that we're looking at, and actually I think that when you look at where we are today as a comms industry, it's evolved so much more, where we have access to more data than we ever had before. The right colleagues are able to make sense of the method of the data that's in front of us. And so, I look at it, misinformation, disinformation, I think that there's interesting time and it's exciting time to think about how we can deal with recovery, something that would have been potentially harder, say, 10, 15 years ago.
Okay, very interesting perspective, Jeremy. I mean, you sort of talked about it not being all gloom and doom as many of us seem to feel it is. And it is true, there's many more stakeholders in the fray now trying to figure out how to sort of respond to this, cut it off at the source, or protect the end user from sort of the negative effects of fake news. And that's something that we can talk about in more detail. And you're absolutely right that audiences are more sophisticated. The technology is getting more sophisticated, which is both good and bad. So the bad players have sort of much more power going forward as well. So that's something I think we also need to keep in mind in terms of education and awareness, that the bad guys are always many, many steps ahead. And what are we going to do in our practices to sort of keep that in mind as we are planning ahead as well? And I thought, and we would sort of move to talking about concrete impacts, because we will get to the aspect that you mentioned, Jeremy, of recovery. But first, I thought we could make it clearer to our audience. What are the kind of impacts we're looking at that fake news has on brands in terms of trust, reputation, and maybe other issues as well? And maybe we'll start with Antoine and then Emma to begin with, to lead us through this sort of round of the discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Anu. Yes, and this is still very much unfolding, right? So this kind of fake news era is still very much here. We're not entirely sure actually what we're looking into, really. It comes to us, especially in Southeast Asia, in some markets that are really, I'm thinking about Vietnam, for instance, that is really facing a lot of fake news issues, and the regulator is actually taking steps to address that with frameworks. And I think it's coming up, and that's good news, because it hurts. Brands are hurt really with fake news. But so on the positive side of thing, and so I want like Jeremy to kind of believe that there is an opportunity here. Fake news is kind of putting out the need for credible voices to show up. So what we see is that there is a rising expectation among stakeholders that powerful, credible voices kind of get more established. And we see from our research that the most trusted stakeholder or person you would trust in the context of fake news is the technical experts from the companies. So for our peers in-house on the line today, think about who has a technical kind of knowledge that would bring facts to the table. And that's really currently the most credible voice. The second thing is we are seeing a rise in trust in traditional media and search engines. So there is there is more and more use of search given the rise of fake news. People really want to understand the dynamic that is at play. I just talked about that earlier, and they want to kind of get that point of view straight as they go about it. So the implication for brands is, what is your search strategy about? Back 10 years ago, we were really talking about search, and then we moved to something else. And now it's really back to the table in the context of fake news. The more challenging side of it is obviously it can be very damaging for brand if you don't identify the fake news or news being fake as quickly enough or correct it quickly enough. For instance, we recently worked with a firm whose product was presented as making COVID symptoms worse. And obviously in the current context, that's very challenging for the brand. So you need to take steps to address that.
Emma?
Yeah, great. And you know, I think in terms of where Antoine is also talking to in terms of this need for credible voices, I think one of the things as a brand that fake news is also doing, and I'm going to take it to a slightly different place here, is that, you know, it is driving a lot that is just not about the brand. You know, it's fueling a lot of discussions around society. And I think, you know, in terms of as a business, if you build trust, there are a lot of issues that are going on right now that you've really got to be able as a brand to work out, how do you tread this line very carefully? How do you shield yourself away from fake news? But how do you also rise at a moment in time that might, you know, that actually reflects your values? And I'm just going to touch on something that is probably, you know, very close to a lot of our US colleagues' hearts, which is obviously the Black Lives Matter, which has obviously taken, you know, dominated a lot of conversations recently. You know, diversity and inclusion at HP, it is a really big and important topic to us. But what it actually did was it took us a moment in time to take a step and fact check how were we doing. And we realized that we wanted to do more. And so as a brand, we made a concrete commitment to double the number of Black employees at executive level by about 2025. And I think, you know, what this really is about is that fake news can also drive a moment in time where as a brand, you're able to live through your values and you're able to put a positivity out there. And I think that also is something as well, that being able to live the purpose, to be able to represent the values of your brand is also really important. And this, again, it goes a long way. I know, as I've always mentioned, towards trust. You know, you've got to build trust out there right now. You've got to be seen to be credible, and to be able to make commitments and to be able to deliver against those commitments as a brand really starts to give you an element of, if people believe it, that they will also start to follow you. And I think it's fake news to that point creates as much opportunities as it does challenges for us today.
Right, thank you, Emma. You're absolutely right. The question of value sort of is rising to the front and center of discussions these days. And I think especially with everyone in COVID at home and glued onto their computer screens, there's much more knowledge about what's happening out there beyond your narrow sort of daily professional or social lives, right? That there's this sort of knowledge that there are these injustices and things happening out there that we didn't really know about earlier. But then there's the danger of what aspect of those can you sift fact and fiction from? So that then becomes the next set of things that companies have to deal with, which is looking at whether their values are being distorted through various different platforms. Are they misrepresented somewhere? So that's another element, I suppose, of crisis communication that comes in. But I wanted to quickly ask Jeremy if we're looking at, and I'm still trying to spell out the impacts for companies in sort of tangible ways, apart from trust and reputation. What else are we looking at in terms of longer and shorter term impacts of fake news on companies? And can impacts be measured and recovery strategies designed with sort of this differentiation in mind?
Yeah, you know, look, I think that there's some tangible impacts when it comes to, and I try to break it down to B2B brands and B2C brands, right? You know, I think that some of the misinformation issues have raised about, yeah, people are taking a longer time to research about a product before they decide to buy it based on that. And I do think that is I would say, one example of impact, but it's a longer sales cycle, right? For these consumer products, right? And then I'm seeing that there's ways to kind of look about it again in terms of engaging the right channels, writing the right promos in stage. So I think that's just a small dent on it, but after a while, the recovery isn't that long. But what I am seeing interesting, some of the work that we're doing is there is potentially less and less impact on B2B brands that have really invested a lot of time during this period of time around doing corporate reputation work, which is a combination of what Emma and Antoine also talked about as well. Sometimes, I would say, and I'm trying to be encouraging to a lot of people on the panel, it's probably the best time to take on a job in corporate reputation right now. This is, I know that a lot of, many years ago, a lot of agencies were saying you want to be the big digital guru. I like that, and I think that was great, but now it's probably the best time to be neck deep into corporate reputation work. I'm seeing a lot of, in cases for B2B brands, when they've been really invested around the corporate reputation story, mission, vision, values, for example, what they talked about, credibility, thought leadership, those kinds of things typically get surfaced out as we talk about what search can bring as well. So I do think that there's a lot of information if brands have really think about how they put that information out there in trying to minimize the impact on misinformation. So I know I kind of see it that way, like the impact in two of those sectors. But the next level I also want to look at it is, I find that if you're a brand, the first thing you want to ask yourself, do you appeal to consumers emotionally? Or do you appeal to your, I wouldn't say consumers, do you appeal to your stakeholders emotionally, or do you appeal to your stakeholders rationally, right? That's another way to look at it. That for some products where, the appeal and the sell is purely emotional. Sometimes it helps when we see some of the misinformation comes in and they have passionate group of fans who come in and say, this is not what we know, this fake, this is not what the brand stands for. We're very clear about the pricing around these pairs of sneakers. We're very clear about the pricing around all the longevity on that piece of handset or whatever you have there. So which is great, that people are jumping in, and especially for companies that really appeal rationally to stakeholders. Sometimes the misinformation looks a little too good to be true. Again, that's based on a brand's corporate reputation, what they've done around trust and safety, et cetera, et cetera. So, and I'm saying that that's another way to look at the impact of it. So I would kind of look at it as, just to summarize it, the impact on sales cycle, does it lengthen or does it shorten? And the impact on, does it continue to build that divide between emotional connection to your stakeholders and the rational connection to your stakeholders?
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. So if I'm understanding it correctly, the three of you have said that building trust preemptively. So this is something that needs to be built in sort of through all the practices that you're doing way in advance, so that the trust and reputation are thereby not dented with sort of the inflow of this fake news. So it's more preemptive rather than, say, disaster management in a way. Okay, got that. So then I'll move on then to Larry. And social media platforms, as we all know, have been criticized for their role in propagating fake news. And for you, and specifically, brand safety and trust would play out in a slightly different way than it does for the others. So I'd just like to know your thoughts on that.
Sure. I mean, that definitely, in terms of, we've come under fire from with a lot of political campaigns, like you see in the US and across, even in different regions that we see in Asia. We see a lot of different, trends taking off in terms of fake news, people criticizing Twitter for not doing enough. But the fact is that fake news by itself, it's very hard to define. The whole, it's always, what do you call that? It's always playing a catch-up game where we're trying to identify the next wave of fake news, what is real, what is not. And to Antoine's point, at Twitter we have a strong policy on manipulated media, and that by itself, it's really hard to define without we have a strong set of AI tools as well as people who are looking into it for when it gets reported to us. But the use of technology, with even like videos and very subtle changes in videos, it's something that it's always a cat and mouse game where you're trying to catch up. And let me draw you to the example. In recently, there was a video circulated of Senator Elizabeth Warren, and what it simply did was just to slow down a little bit of some of the video, just to show that she appeared like she was stumbling, but that was such a subtle catch that it became very quietly circulated before people came down on it, and it was reported in mainstream media that was the case. But I think the point that some of my panelists were saying that the audience itself is actually becoming more educated. They're a lot more savvy. Jeremy alluded, that they audiences now are a lot more discerning as well, and people are more questioning about what brand safety has to offer for brands. And in particular, for Twitter, we have a set of brand safety policies as well as advertising policies that we enforce. So like no COVID-19 directly related advertising, no profiteering of that. But I think the onus actually is a lot, to what Emma said, it's a lot on the brands themselves owning that message, owning the values that you have. More and more, people are saying to brands that we want clarity, we want transparency, we want authenticity. You need to walk the talk. So if something goes against your brand values as a company, then you need to be able to own up to it. You need to be able to recover from it. And I think that's a point where Jeremy said, the recovery cycle is becoming shorter. And that's something that we're kind of seeing as well. And we also seeing a lot of companies who are stepping up to it. There was a recent, I'm just referring to this, there was a recent Accenture survey that looked at how companies were doing good in society. And 47% of consumers are walking away from brands who aren't walking the talk, meaning they're not embracing the values that they had. So in this time and age, actually walking the talk actually does have that positive spin. As what Jeremy said, there's something very fundamentally authentic about being able to own the kind of values that you have as a company, as brands. And I think as communicators, it is then a call to action for us to really become true to what the company is doing. If there is fake news being circulated, if there are sources that you're referencing that may not be accurate, then you come out, you own up to it, and move on. Companies are human ultimately, so it's a matter of recovering. And the flip side of it, if you're true to it, people are flocking to your brands. You build loyalty, you build trust, and you build a sense of credibility that hasn't been hard to achieve. Gone are the days when brands were top down and brands were one way. You simply disseminated. But now it's so interactive. People have that opportunity, and brands have that opportunity to interact directly with their audiences, with their core consumers, and so on. And that's something that we see, people becoming more and more savvy to.
Right. Thank you, Larry. That makes a lot of sense. All of you have pointed out that companies need to have sort of these preemptive policies in place already towards promoting your values and building trust. But I have a question from the audience, and this is something that I think we talked about a little earlier, and I think maybe Jeremy could take this question, which is, for many companies and smaller brands especially that don't have these sophisticated comms mechanisms in place, what are some good best practices for recovering from fake news or misinformation negatively affecting your brand or reputation?
So one of the things I've seen quite a fair bit is this notion that the human mind can only deal with one brand they are ridiculously passionate about. They have 9 brands that they are passionate about. And then the remaining 90, that something happens, they'll just like raise their eyebrow, like, oh, that's happened. And I think that is what we're seeing right now. And so And that's the same logic around 119 and 90, which about how people engage with bad news, etc. So, that's the same philosophy, right? I think that the main thing that I'll probably say to a lot of brands is, think about the incident that you have that was circulated, where was that source is, and think about how, was it the source that was created to mislead, or just ignorant, or unfortunately, customers that started sharing that piece of news because they didn't know any better, right? And then think about what caused it. If you had someone that created a piece of fake site, a piece of news that meant to kind of mislead the information, that's where you need to then, if you don't have a lot of tools, but I would then say that's the first thing you want to think about, right? What did it let a stakeholder really spend that time and effort to create a site or piece of news or mock it up to mislead you? So that's one. And maybe from there, you can start thinking about the root of that issue. Again, I'm thinking about trying to do really scrappy and grassroots style. The second thing is, it was a case of there was a lot of stories that was shared around that piece of news that moved really fast. And that's where you go like, okay, look, clearly now I have to now think about on the other side, how do I educate the majority of my stakeholders really quickly at the quickest amount of time? So that's where you think about now, do I need to start engaging openly with the mass, thinking of putting a press statement? Do I think about engaging with the mass media to get that out? So again, I would say for brands that typically don't have that resources, really think about how they can come to deal with it. Do they want to prioritize getting to the root of the issue and why that stakeholder group, etc., want to spread a piece of misinformation about you, or what caused a whole bunch of people to spread or retweet or reshare or send it into via their DMs into the piece of information? I think if they start looking at it again without a lot of access to data, maybe that's another way to start finding how they can get around it.
Thank you, Jeremy. Would either Antoine or Emma like to sort of add to that? Emma?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jeremy summed it up in a similar way. I think it's, I don't think everybody has infinite resources. I think, as a comms people, we are very good at doing things very resourcefully. I think listening is really important. And however you do that, even if it's down to a Google search, and knowing what's being said about you is important. I think to what Jeremy has said there, and I said earlier as well, it's not about reacting immediately. It is about assessing, where is that news come from? What is the platform that it's on? And how far has that news gone? Because actually you don't want to fuel a debate sometimes. And actually, information, if it is inaccurate, it can, one of the great things that I think we have as communicators is great relationships. If you've got good relationships with your media and somebody has written a story that is inaccurate in you've got that relationship, you can pick up the phone and you can explain and you can ask them to post in, a statement. And I think that's probably one of the things that maybe we haven't touched on so far, is that relationships really do matter. And as much as we talk about social media, we do know media outlets also get information that isn't always correct. So I would also say it's not just about that ability to react and respond in that moment. It's also think about the ecosystem around that news and how do you use your relationships to also help you to guide what that right response might be.
Right, thank you. I have a sort of follow-up question that I think Antoine might be well placed to answer, but if not, Antoine, let me know. One of the questions is, how do you track how far and fast the fake news has traveled? So I think people want to have a more, get a better understanding of how you do this.
Right, well, that's a very good question. I think as part of the monitoring, so there are a lot of tools we use for that tracking, and at Edelman we use a tool that's called Command Center, and we really look, I think, at the entire ecosystem of media. The challenge with fake news is that, and I think that's one of the questions that we have here, and maybe we're going to touch on this, is that when you spot the news, it's already very spread already. So you need to have a very robust monitoring system, and perhaps some of my fellow panelists can answer that. But the challenge, I think, moving a little bit away from that question, but going back to Emma's point, which to me is much more challenging, because actually spotting the information is not in itself very difficult, right? It's something that is really, that can be set up quite easily. The challenge is in the assessment, right? So you need to look at the source, you need to look at the URLs, for instance, Do they have strange sounding extensions like .infonet, .offer rather than .com? The second question that you may want to ask yourself is the story reported elsewhere? For instance, more established outlet, perhaps Reuters or BBC or CNN, which would make the news more likely to be true. Also read the disclosure, right? Be sure to read any disclosure so that you can determine where the content is originating from. That may or may not be the case on the piece of news that you're reading, but if that is the case, that may give you an indication. Who is the author? Are they credible? Are they real in your view? Ask the expert. And I think, Emma, you're making a very fundamental point here. Ask the people who know. So go around your journalist friend and tell them what you think of this thing, right? And perhaps they'll give you the opportunity to post a statement. But most importantly, they'll give you their own reading. Because one thing that is interesting in fake news is, and back to Jeremy's point, is a fake news usually is appealing to your emotional brain much more than your rational brain. And so if that news somewhat feels like, you said, I think, Jeremy, too good to be true, but pretty much feels like strongly emotionally charged, it's more likely to be a fake news. Especially when people are feeling stressed and angry and anxious in the current times, there's more fake news appealing to our emotions. And so if the news that you're looking into have those dimensions, then you're probably looking into a fake news.
Hey guys, I've just got a thing to add to Antoine's point. I'm just going to say it's hot off the press. You heard it first from me. I'm going to launch a YouTube channel. I'm going to put my a piece of fake news to my mom. And I'm going to ask her, is this real or fake? And she's just going to read all these and say, it's real, it's fake, it's real, it's fake. And I'm going to make lots of money on that. Because, one of the things I'm also seeing is it's a demographics we're also seeing right now that I still said before, are a lot more in tune on what real news is today. I feel that one of the things that looking at some of the numbers or working with clients is that actually, I don't know what you guys, and love to hear from my panelists, but the consumption of credible news has gone up during COVID-19 as well. And that's why, again, I see it as an upside, right? Or how we're going through right now. I'm talking to journalists, and they're saying that their readership number or time on site has gone up during these times, which means that people are really taking the additional effort to educate themselves around a piece of news, including my mother, who thank God isn't on this call, right? But I think that that's another way to look at it. And it's I would still say, let's not forget that we are, again, in a lot of markets that we're operating in, a lot of markets that the people are dialing in for this call have gotten a lot more sophisticated in understanding what is real or what is fake, especially when, it's too emotionally charged, it sounds too good to be true. The URL looks dodgy. If you click on that a social network and it doesn't have a trusted eye in there about the publisher, those are little things that continue to build credibility on how fake or unreal that URL is.
Right. Thank you, Jeremy. I think I'm going to later play the devil's advocate, and being a sort of a critical communications scholar, I will sort of bring in my sort of take on this a bit later. But first, I want to sort of put Larry back in the picture and wanted to get a little more detail as to what, if we're trying to tackle fake news at its source, which is social media companies, so that the rest of us have a slightly easier time of it, perhaps. What are some of the initiatives that have been taken at Twitter, say specifically to sort of to combat this? You mentioned that you have some policies in place, but I'm thinking in terms of, say, tools. Do you have human fact checkers? Do you have AI? Just a bit of that information, please.
Sure. I mean, in Twitter, to kind of to allude back to Emma's point, no one social media company can police the entire internet and the entire platform. So while we rely very strongly on reporting tools as well as the AIs, catching fake news at its source, it's an incredibly complicated and difficult task. So we've started in that sense enforcing policies around misinformation. For example, when President Trump, put forth the statement that you can take what was that drug called, hydrochlorine, as a cure to COVID. We put a misinformation label on him, and we were not afraid to do so because we felt that the public interest had the right to know that. So these policies are in place for a reason, to try to protect some of the less sophisticated audiences who are using Twitter as well as using other social media. And we also have quite strong, how do you say, account policies, in the sense that if you are reported to be spreading too much misinformation, or if you're using particular accounts, that are used in bad faith, or with malicious intentions, we have and we will suspend or delete those accounts. And just recently, we actually revealed, we've just disclosed a whole bunch of accounts that were state-backed, and state actors who are using it to spread misinformation. And that itself it's part of what we are doing, trying to arrest, the root of the problem. But back again, trying to when we are trying to arrest it at the root, there is so much that goes between the cracks, and there's a lot that we don't catch, and that's when we rely on people to be more educated, for Twitter users, for any social media users. When you're consuming your content, that's when you need that critical voice in your head telling you, okay, this doesn't sound right. Like what Jeremy said, it's too good to be true. Something is suspicious. Let me look into it. And we're seeing that as a trend, because mainstream media are picking up. As what Jeremy said, the New York Times, Washington Post, even Straits Times, we've seen that edition numbers go up, and that itself is a kind of a sign that people are becoming more savvy to what is the truth. And they are more skeptical. People are a lot more critical about the sources that they consume. So while we can arrest the factual part of it, we can arrest the some of the misinformation at the source when it comes to facts. As what Antoine said, when it appeals to the emotional side of you, and we are all guilty of that, where you are attached to particular brands, or you're looking at brands who are appealing to you emotionally. That's when we struggle, because that itself is on the user itself to kind of develop a sense of what is right, what is wrong. Is this right for me? Is this is this good for me? Am I referencing the right sources? Am I consuming the right channels, and so on? And that's where I think over time people just simply become wiser to the tricks of these bad actors, or or any kind of these misinformation players who are out there in the market.
Hey, I just feel like I probably want to come to Larry just to add in a point as well, right? I don't think I mean, unfortunately, it's been talked a lot about that in the press, or how the social networks are facing a lot of heat as well. But I do think that it's a wider movement as an industry. I'm looking at internet hosting companies who've really taken a step up to say, look, we have zero tolerance if our sites are being used as hosts for misinformation as well. So the likes of a GoDaddy would shut down a site if they know they're hosting someone that is creating a news portal just to spread misinformation as well, right? So I do think that it's a collective part where a lot of technology companies that play in a space where either whole or house information to all take a role in that as well. I guess, for me, I just wanted to throw this out to anyone, I guess, in the group. I mean, look, I think the other thing that we probably need to talk about, which we haven't, and I'm mindful of time, is misinformation or fake news in the world of mobile closed social networks, right? The SMS, the WhatsApp, the iMessage, how do we deal with that? I'm just curious, what do my fellow panelists think about, how do we deal with things that we can't track anymore, we can't see in the open, and anyone's thoughts on that? I know if you have a point of view as well, I'd love to hear that as well.
Yeah, sure, Jeremy. That's a great question. I think while I do agree that there is greater sophistication of audiences, I still have this nagging feeling that most audiences are not critical enough to be able to distinguish the good from the bad news, or to be able to distinguish the nuances. So I also have a question from one of the audience members that kind of is something that I have in mind as well. When we're looking at people's attention spans are reducing day by day. We're not reading beyond a headline. We're lucky enough if people are reading a couple of paragraphs. What then do we do in these situations where information might be accurate, but we've always had this issue of slanted headlines, slanted information? How are we then going to manage that? And how are we going to manage this in, say, WhatsApp groups or closed communication circles is something that I think all of us, whether we're brands or educators, we're trying to think about. And I think that the answer that all of you sort of have been pointing to is, of course, building trust is one, but building critical faculties is the other. And I think I'd sort of, I know that, say, Larry's talked about how Twitter is doing that. And as an educator myself, that's part of the work that I do, which is to sort of point out to people where the dangers lie. So I wanted to know also then, I thought sort of picking up from what Jeremy is saying, is what are companies doing? Are companies doing something in this space to sort of bring about that sort of educational element as well?
Is that for me, Anu? Yeah, I mean, I'll take that from an HP perspective. Look, you know, are we taking, I think there's an offense and a defense. And when I listen to a lot of what we're saying today, the one comment I do want to make, I've been in the industry a long time, and I don't think it's ever been as interesting as it is today. You know, I think the complexities that technology has brought, I think the way where Jeremy was talking about the way that buyers, you know, are now trying to buy. As communicators, we've gone from, we had one mode of communication, which was a press release, to thousands of different places that can be, our brands can be represented and be spoken about. And I think what we've got to be very careful is you don't fall into this defensive constant place, that you're always thinking about, is that right? Has that news been represented wrong? Is that headline right? You will be chasing your tail forever. And I continue to say it is definitely about, and I think as Antoine mentioned as well, a tiering process. And it is about being able to have those clear protocols around assessing what will have a bigger impact. Because then on the flip side, you can spend the time where you actually do have the opportunity to drive positivity. You know, one of the things that we've been doing with our executives, you know, from a corporate reputation perspective, we spent a lot of time on, say, LinkedIn. You know, we know that this isn't a platform right now where we understand the buyer's mindset. We know that they're looking for information, they're looking to buy. And so that ability to be there authentically on a peer-to-peer network where it's not about the brand, it's also about the individual, also takes some of that essence away about fake news. Because if you've got executives who are standing there, who are being credible sources, who are having authentic conversations, then actually, again, it's not about the brand itself and the fake news, it's about, do I trust this person? And do I trust the network that this person is in? And do I trust these conversations that are being had? And so I think it's from, in terms of education, it's about look at the channels that you have and think about how you use them in the right way to drive stories that can also be positive for you as a brand, as well as those places where you do need to monitor because you know that there is potentially negativity that could be brewing. So I sort of think that's the way that I tend to look at it at the moment, Anu, in terms of the different landscapes that we've got.
Right, thank you, Emma. That absolutely makes sense. The fact that you can't use one media space, you can't use all your media spaces the same way, right? There has to be sort of that element of differentiation. And I'll sort of ask Antoine whether he wants to add to the same.
Yeah, no, I think it's very, very rightly said, Emma. And so we need to increase our literacy in that field. That's for sure. It's a new emerging kind of dimension of communications. It's here to stay. It's becoming a parameter in our operating landscape. And so we need to deal with that. We need to also educate our business leaders and help them understand the implications of fake news. Because all of this, and I'd be curious to know, Emma, how you guys do that at HP, because you know it's business material ultimately, and we need to the best shield that you have, I think, against fake news is your trust ecosystem. Is your trust ecosystem strong enough to at least give you in the first hours of a fake news coming up, the benefit of the doubt. And so buy this precious time so that you can respond to the situation. And in terms of just and you touched on that really, Anu, so I'll be back real quick on this. In terms of the things that you need to do as a brand, I think, which is critical to kind of respond to fake news is, one, make sure that you engage your third parties. This is the time when your voice is going to be like, not necessarily believed, not as credible as you would like. So engage your advocates and mobilize them to support your story and to bring a balanced view that is not only yours. And the second thing is, oftentimes, as you dig into the understanding of the dynamic of a fake news, you notice inconsistencies, right? You notice. So I give you an example. We were working on the MSG issue, or the Chinese restaurant syndrome in the US, and it's an important issue over there because most people believe that when you eat MSG, you become sick. The entire kind of health industry knows that this is not the case. There is a huge kind of prejudice around that and preconceived ideas. And so we started working on that. And one of the things that we started to say is, look, if that was the case, would the entire Asia have headache? No. So that's the one thing that you start, when you look into fake news, oftentimes you spot inconsistencies, things that don't make sense, bring that up. And have that said by not yourself, but your third party or advocates working with you.
That's an excellent point. Have sort of bring in the people that can support you in sort of this whole, so it's a multi-stakeholder effort, right? So I think that's where even the questions that I'm getting from audience members are sort of asking these questions, and then what can we do in terms of what are, say, suppose fake news can result in defamation of character. How can this be tackled? What would you say to this? Because I'm thinking of it in terms of, say, if you want to bring in your third-party resources, or you want to bring in some other, I don't know, what would you say to this? Jeremy, would you like to take this? Or you're on silent.
So the question was, how would you deal with fake news if it's a case of defamation of character?
I'm assuming this relates to reputation, right, broadly, but the question says specifically defamation of character. Have any of you dealt with this, or what are your thoughts about it?
Yeah, I guess the first question I would then ask whoever asked this is, are we approaching this from a business perspective, or are we talking about this from a political perspective, right? I think that, as defamation of character in a business sense, if I could just use that example first, is really around that person, how does that person play in its organization as a company? And again, I still think it boils down to the strength of the corporate reputation of the firm, the way the firm is looked at, and the way the firm looks and plans its leadership, and what the firm stands for, what the company stands for in terms of leadership expectation of its employees. So I typically think that in that stakes, if it's defamation of character as a business leader, the firm always gets thrown into it. And then the firm would have a point of view on their hiring policy, people policy, etc. Right. So that's where I think that, I think that's where a firm's articulation of what they stand for and who they hire comes into play. Now, the part, I guess it's fairly interesting and fairly exciting. And I love to spend a round of 4 beers with this person talked about in a political side as well. And I think we're going to spare Larry the chance of answering this question because he will get dragged in. But so on the political side, I think that is has become a big part of what we saw in the Singapore politics and the lead up to the Singapore elections as well. And I think that in such situations, it's also, I feel it's a big part of the channels that host these conversations to regulate them. I mean, it's really on them to do so as well. And also, I guess, I wouldn't probably say, and I probably want to open up a can of worms, but I'll probably leave it at that. From a channel's perspective, that's what they need to do for an impact on a person's character. I think that if you had played that, the generation online will start looking at how this person also associated and played that kind of game back in the past as well. And as we all saw in the recent Singapore elections, you can't run away from the woke generation, right? Mm-hmm. Online, they will find that out and they will dig out the past as well. So yeah, probably want to end it on that part. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I think,
I just to comment just really quickly on that. So on the defamation side of things, because it's a very normal reaction to be willing to take a strong legal stance against any fake news arising, and then you may have. So our view on this is that there are two things that you need to be mindful of. One is to refrain from taking down the story. Oftentimes, brands come in and would say, look, take this down. This is not true. This is defamatory for the people and so on. So it's very tempting, but it usually backfires because it's being seen as you have something to hide and you did something wrong. And so it adds to the perception that something wrong is happening pretty much. And the other thing is being mindful of short-term legal actions, which is a strong temptation, I think, at the beginning. It's not in itself necessarily wrong, but you have to make sure that you do that from a very solid ground, so it doesn't morph into a broader David and Goliath type of issue, right? That the company can be thrown into.
Thank you. I think that was, I just wanted to get that question out there because it's something, especially in this the Singaporean context, that we hear of a lot, and it's sort of good to sort of discuss it. We will not wade into the politics of this for the time being, and I'd rather sort of now move on to the next set of questions, and I'll kickstart this set, which is about basically what do you see as the most pressing challenges for companies as they respond to sort of this, what will be an unceasing sort of flood of bad news online. And I'd sort of asked Larry to begin with this, and then we can move forward. What do you see as the main challenges?
Sure. I think the main challenge for us as communicators and for the industry in general is that being the, how do I put this? The courage as well as the the belief to hold true to your values. I think that's something that we were seeing a lot more of as with the spread of fake news and with misinformation and disinformation being so prevalent. These are not new tactics. This is something that has been ongoing. To Antoine's point, the MSG debate has been decades. My mom would kill me if she saw me using MSG. I think that's the kind of pervasiveness, and these are not new problems. These are actually age-old problems. Taking down articles, getting applying pressure, character assassinations. These are not new issues. But I think more and more, I think what the positive side of it is that people are responding, and that's something that we see as the upside of this hypersensitized world that we're in, where you are able to articulate clearly what your brand stands for, what the kind of positions that you assume. I think that's something that is very it speaks to a lot more consumers directly, and now we have the chance to connect with consumers directly. Now brands can, interact so much more closely with their audiences. And if you speak their language, if you walk the talk, I think that's where we see the rewards coming in, where people are, flocking to certain brands. For example, in K-pop, we see so much increased activity going on, and it's not just in the area of music. You see, K-pop, K-pop stands becoming a lot more politically active and so on, and that's where we see a lot of people, gravitating towards the causes and the kind of values that they themselves hold true. And I think this is an age where I think being under the magnifying glass, is not a bad thing altogether. I think it throws a light on brands to, behave in an authentic manner and behave in a transparent manner. And that's where, we see the kind of opportunities there are out for brands out there.
Thank you, Larry. Maybe Jeremy, would you like to respond to the same question, which is, what are the challenges? Larry's talked about the fact that, all of you have pointed out that there are tremendous opportunities for brands in terms of propagating their values and retaining sort of a loyal customer base by being authentic. and whether you would like to sort of add a bit more about that, or in terms of sort of what are some practical, logistical, technical challenges that you foresee going forward?
Yeah, I think I guess the challenge is, brands that are a lot more mature. I'll use that in terms of the years of business, and they've grown up, and they've been hit and criticized in the past, and they've been comfortable with the skin that, it's fair for me to live with the fact that 80% of my own customers are not going to jump to my defense at any point in time, and they learn how to build their stories around trust and reputation, etc. I think I do think that it will be a challenge for single product type of companies, where they have known for being really, really good at a single product. And once they start thinking about their brand, how are they going to evolve out of category, are they taking over market share? And those are the things that then becomes a little tricky for them as well, right? So I think it's, from a branding perspective, I like to take it as the evolution and brands growing old and being okay. And the second part I probably want to say is, I'm also looking at some sectors where, let's take it closer to the country that we're, Singapore, for example. It's, some brands have lived with the fact that a majority of their customers don't even love them, especially brands in the services space. Like, I'm just going to say that up front, that I use my telco. Am I going to jump into my telco's defense when something happens to them? Less likely so, but that doesn't mean I won't retain them as my telco, because they made things so much easier for me as well. So, from a branding perspective, it's good for brands to also understand, how they play in the sector. Would their customers jump into their defense when something goes wrong, or their customers would shame them when something goes wrong, right? And so that applies on sectors. And I think in the services space, transport, transport, banking, telcos tend to be those sectors where stakeholders and customers tend to be less vocal about their love. And then how do you understand, how do you read those behaviors, and how do you assess the impact on your brand?
Right. I saw Emma nodding quite a bit when Jeremy was making his points. Emma, would you like to add anything more to that?
Yeah, I think both from what Larry has said in terms of what do brands stand for, and Jeremy in terms of, customers naming and shaming you. I think the things that are really pressing from our perspective as a brand right now, I've already touched on it, are things like the social issues, environmental issues, governance issues. People today, our customers believe that for HP, that we are going to lead the way, and that we have a duty of care to the communities that we work and represent for. I mean, I've already spoken about diversity and inclusion is a big part of what we do. And we do that across the region, whether that's in India or in China or in Japan. But a big part for us is sustainable impact. We are a product company. We produce printers. We produce a lot of equipment. We have a lot of packaging. And so it's really important, particularly as these issues become much more, if I look at millennials, sustainability is a top of mind reason why they buy a brand. So we have to demonstrate what we're doing as a brand to really make sure that, we are environmentally savvy. And again, it's this piece that I'm talking about, putting out a commitment and driving an action. We're committed to reduce single-use plastic by 75% by 2025. And what you'll see is within that worldwide initiative is throughout every region, a series of initiatives that we are actually then going to do that will make sure that we meet that goal. And I think that's really what it is. And to some extent, that transparency, that ability to be under the microscope, because we do have to be very open as a brand. We have to be transparent, and to be credible, we've got to be very true to the convictions or the commitments that we make. I think the other thing that's important, and Anu, you spoke about it earlier, in terms of education, one of the big things that we're battling, that we've seen with COVID, is the real digital divide that is really happening across the region. And I think more so than any other region, we recognize that, that underserved communities, and their access to technology and literacy is a big, big issue. Again, we came out about a month ago, making a commitment that this year we will work with 100,000 youths, or 10,000 youths across Southeast Asia, to give them access to training, to give them access to digital literacy. Now, are we going to teach them about fake news? Not necessarily, but are we going to teach them about, how to use a laptop, how to use Office, how to use the fundamentals of technology? community. And I think that that is really important. And that's something as a brand we really believe in. It is our responsibility to support our communities as much as our employees and our partners in terms of how do we address some of those bigger challenges that are out there that we know people are talking about, that we know can be the reason why people will or won't shame you, depending on what it is that you're being discussed about. The only other quick thing I would say, it's more from an in-house perspective. I don't know how many in-house people are on the call, but I think the relationship with stakeholders right now is highly, highly important, more so than ever. Having a seat at the table, understanding the decisions that are being made, and to be able to make sure that those decisions are the ones that really allow you to be credible and that you're able to build the stories that you need to from there in the quickest time possible, or get the accuracy of information that you need based on what you are dealing with is really, really important. And I think a lot of the relationships that we have to span the business. It's government relations, it's manufacturing, it's supply chain. And so I think relationships in-house right now are really, really critical in terms of dealing with the current environment that we're in as well.
Right. Thank you, Emma. Antoine, would you, I'm sort of, from not being from a sort of corporate perspective, I'm trying to also look at in terms of technically or in terms of human resources, what kind of challenges, or do you foresee any challenges whatsoever in terms of tackling fake news given the limitations of resources and sort of manpower?
Yeah, well, those are very important and I think emerging topics. But my perspective on this is, it seems to me, and as a father, I'm very concerned about that when I try to tell my kids what you're seeing here is this, and this is, be mindful of that. And part of that, I think Emma brought that up very nicely, is how do we actually get more literate and savvy to what we are actually looking into? And this reality is becoming very distorted, very biased, very filtered, and it's going to become more and more difficult for us as people just to look at the world as it is, right? And so that's the first, I think, in human history that we are in this situation. And so that's a massive challenge from a personal, corporate, what have you, standpoint. So that the first caveat. With that in mind, it seems to me that the role of automation, the role of technology is obviously more and more prevalent than ever before. All the tracking that we can do, the algorithm analysis that we have as tools are becoming more and more intelligent here. There's going to be human intelligence on top of that, but I'm just looking, for instance, at the side of the business in our agency that's actually dealing with that. The tools that they are using are impressive, and they really run 90% of the work that needs to be done, so that the human intelligence you really apply to things that correlation can't yet be made by just the human mind. But it's going to change. In 5 years, it's going to be already another world. So, I mean, if you don't have resource, well, get the tools, because they are moving at lightning speed, and brands like HP and other technology firms really look into that. But what it means is that we are going into a world that is very hybrid. So there's really hybrid threats around the corner, where there's deliberate intention with weaponized information, difficulty to decipher what that is. And trust building is really your single best option in terms of longer strategy, so that, when this thing comes up, you have more buffer. And research shows that brands that have trust kind of go through crisis better than others, so they don't have that like narrative decrease that others would face, and they recover faster. So it's both a bumper and kind of bump when you go into recovery. So that's one part, the longer term. The second part is really your ability to display a rapid response and to use content that is ready to go, and that can be, put across platforms, and to aggressively, so that's really the advice that we give our clients on fake news, is to be aggressive, right? You go full on, full power, right? Depending on the nature of, but back to the MSG issue, well, we really went and used the current issues in the US, which is more really a debate around the cultural divide and racism, and kind of like use that narrative to infuse the idea that, MSG is perhaps just a biased way of looking at a cultural dimension of food, right? So you need to go full on. And one of the things that is perhaps more challenging on the brand side is that it's scary, because you need to go all in with all your advocates to tell that bigger story very quickly and showing proof and evidence and information. So you cannot be timid in your response in something that is unsure, that is moving quickly, that is morphing and changing. So to Emma's point, and you were saying that earlier, leadership education is absolutely fundamental. I think it's going to be in any playbook or any leadership training in the future in the MBAs of our next 5 or 10 years. That's going to be a base curriculum so that we can really respond to the right level.
Right. Thank you, Antoine. I just wanted to sort of add to that, and this is the part that Emma was talking about. And the reason I sort of keep raising this question is you talked about digital literacy, and that's super important. And the kind of work that I and my sort of critical, my communications academic colleagues do is critical digital literacy, which is exactly sort of trying to fill this gap in between digital literacy, which is, as all of you know, having the tools, but how are we then going to build up cognitive resources amongst sort of now from children that are using technology from 2 years onwards till people in their 90s that are online to get them to be more discerning, more critical. And I think that's kind of the gap that I find in my work, in my research. And it's sort of heartening to know that companies are sort of doing this in their own way. Like we can all talk about education in our own perspective, but the key point is that we all need to be, this has to be a part of everyone's efforts, sort of a whole of society approach. And so I think for me, that sort of this is something that I would like to make as my key point, which is that we can't afford to sort of bury our heads in the sand anymore and think that someone else is going to solve this problem for us, whether it's a tech company or my brand or my school or my government, right? Each of us have a responsibility to sort of weigh in on this and be a little more discerning. And I think for me, that would be sort of the main point that I would sort of like to put out there today. And so it's come to that time where I'm going to ask each of you to give us that one main point that they want to sign off with. And so what is the sort of key or final point that each of you would like to make? And maybe I'll start with Jeremy.
I just think it's the most exciting time in the last 20 years and being in the industry, both on the media side and then onto the agency side. It's a very complex environment. It's a need to understand technology, audiences, the impact of psychology. You know, I went to film school and I ended up being a PR consultant. I've really enjoyed this, but I really think that anyone who's joining this trade right now is going to enjoy it even more. So I think there's a huge opportunity for anyone in that space. But last but not least, also the fact that this is not going to go away. You know, and I'm really taking it positively that the members in the ecosystem are trying their way to battle fake news, whether it's the internet hosting companies, the platforms like Twitter, you know, on the brands like what Emma talked about as well, and Antoine and I, where we share some of the challenges with some of the clients that we consult with as well. So overall, you know, it's progress and 2 steps back, 1 step, 2 steps forward, 1 step back is sometimes progress as well. So that's how I end off. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jeremy. Larry, maybe you could go next.
Sure. You know, I think, you know, we've gone through a lot in this discussion, and I think one of the key things is the topic of trust. And I'm a big fan of Deep Trust Barometer from Edelman, you know, being from ex-Edelman person myself. But I think it's clear to me more than ever before that, you know, building that trust in your brands and through being authentic and transparent in your communication to us as communicators, that's even more important than ever before. You know, just to kind of give a personal example, you know, one of the things that I kind of see happening as well is that it doesn't just fall to the big brands who have the resources as well as the channels to engage with their audiences. You know, small businesses now have actually access to a lot of these different channels and you know, modes of discussion as well. Just recently, I received an email from Grain, which is a local Singapore-based food delivery service, and they publish basically their kind of a transparency report where they outline that they believe in transparent pricing with their chefs, with their produce, in the delivery fees, that they should be kept reasonable and so on. And that actually was a very simple yet very authentic and earnest demonstration of this small company's commitment to being being trusted and being a part of everyone's lives, and it's not just out to make money. So on that note, I think it's a call to us as communicators, to really work with what Emma said and what Antoine said, to work with our communicators, work with our stakeholders as well as our individual companies or clients, to really define what the core values are, what is the mission, and then embrace that fully by communicating that both internally, within the company itself, embracing it, and communicating that externally as well, and owning the message that you have out there. Back to you, Anu. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Shall we Antoine to go next?
Yeah, thanks, Anu. Well, in my view, it's a mindset shift that comes from the top. And we have a role to play as communicators to help our business leads to really embrace that. So this world is going to become more and more hybrid. It's going to be elusive, changing. It's going to remain complex. We're going to see more and more unconventional stuff happening, blended kind of world. And so there's a fundamental change here that is not only about having the playbook, because the playbook, we're going to be able to put that together, but having that intelligence to embrace the fact that what we are seeing may not be what we're seeing, to embrace the fact that something that feels impossible may actually be possible, and to make sure that the decisions that we are making on the back of this kind of acceptance are decisions that are helping us build trust, which is really the key to brand resilience in that context.
Thank you, Antoine. Emma, your closing argument?
Yeah, sure. And I couldn't say more than what Antoine really said there. I think, as strategic communicators, our role has become so much more important. We've all spoken about trust and the growing need for trust in brands. And I know we've mentioned the Edelman Trust Barometer a few times, but it does also show that we're actually trusted as brands more than we are in other institutions. And I think therefore, as comms professionals with a seat at the table, it's really up to us to really understand the line that we have in terms of where our voice can be the most authentic and have a real impact, and where we can lead in a credible way. Now, obviously, we have to keep an eye on the business. It is about, driving to the bottom line still, but with issues like, social, environmental issues, like I've spoken about, there are opportunities to be positive, to, talk to the purpose and the values that you have as an organization, and in a way, maybe even bring an unbiased voice against some of the more polarized commentary that's out there. So, I really do think it's a positive opportunity. It's a great time to be in comms. And I think it's about how do we play the offensive and the defensive in the right way possible. You're on mute.
Thank you, Emma. I think we've sort of reached the end of the event, and the time just flew. It was just so interesting having this conversation with you. And I think I did manage to ask most of the questions that the audience members had, but if there are some questions that weren't answered well enough, could you please drop a line to the PRCA or Tara, and we'll get your answers to you if we haven't answered them satisfactorily right now. But I would sort of like to formally conclude the event by once again thanking all of you, the speakers, for being here, sharing your time, giving your answers. It's such an important issue, and I think the more we empower others with knowledge, the more we help sort of the global ecosystem, kind of like what Jeremy's background is, sort of be this sort of better place for everyone. I wanted to thank the audience for listening in and for their questions. And finally, to thank PRCA Southeast Asia for hosting this event. And have a great evening, everyone.